How's it going, guys? So you may or may not be familiar with kind of like Ableton templates, and basically Ableton templates are a great way to kind of make your workflow a lot better and kind of make your music making sessions very productive. So essentially Ableton templates are kind of like the first thing you see when you open a project. So you'll probably be used to the kind of default one being the 2 channels and the 2 sends and returns. This can be great if you want to start completely from scratch, but it can kind of hold you back in a sense because you're doing a lot of those actions that you would normally do every time you open a project each and every time. Over the years, I've kind of like refined my template, and I think I'm slowly getting to the best personal template for me anyway. Essentially what I'm going to do in this video is talk about what to include in a default template and basically how to set it up and that kind of thing. So before we dive into what's in my template, I just kind of want to run through basically how you would go about locating that template and also saving your own templates. So basically it's as easy as just doing this, going up to File, and then whatever project you have loaded up, you can go Save Live Set as default set. You can also do it as a template if you want to create different variations. But you basically hit one of those once you've set the project up as you want it. So basically once we've run through everything that's on my project, you can hopefully get inspiration, or you can download it from the description. But basically once you've set it up, you basically do that, and what you can do is you can go to your user library and you can go to templates and it should be saved there. So I've basically got this project here, and then I've not updated Ableton 11 with all of them yet, but I've got like folders for different purposes. So templates can be a great way of setting yourself up for a specific purpose very quickly. So I've basically got a bunch of templates, but the one I kind of want to talk about today is going to be that kind of default one you open up for the purpose of just making music. So when it comes to creating your template, essentially you want to think of 3 different things. You want to think of the elements in your track and how you can organize them. You want to think of sends and returns, and you want to think of like any effects on different channels, maybe your master. So for part 1 is essentially what you see here is basically just different groups for different sounds. So this first one, I think it gets dismissed quite a lot, but it's one I have, which is essentially reference tracks. So I normally have space for 3 reference tracks every time I open a project. So sometimes this will be a track I want to reference straight away, or sometimes this will be something I throw in at a later point, maybe to help with arrangement or compare mixes or that kind of thing. So essentially we've got 3 reference tracks and they're all mapped. So I could load 3 tracks in and I could essentially flick between them, and they're basically key mapped, which you can do by going up here, and they're mapped to keys number 1, 2, and 3. So you'll see if I just flick through the different keys, I can solo each of the tracks. So that's essentially the kind of reference track and the kind of process behind that. Next up, I have the vocals. And what I essentially tend to do for these is I'll have one channel as audio and one as MIDI. So for the audio, it'll tend to be probably like an a cappella or a phrase or something. And the MIDI I'll tend to use for those like shorter vocals, and I'll probably either use a simpler or a drum rack for like different ad-libs. You might have seen like some of the jams I've posted on like Instagram where I'll load in like phrases and stuff into drum racks. There's like loads of potential, but I like to keep my options open and have, in the majority of cases, have audio and MIDI And that kind of brings me on to like a point of like, people sometimes wonder like, oh, what should I use? What's better? Both have their advantages and disadvantages. So I like to find that balance, and I find audio works well for certain sounds and MIDI works well for certain sounds. Essentially, you want to create channels for like the different types of sounds you commonly use. So I could have one for like ad-libs, one for like vocal chops if I was to slice a vocal. There's loads of potential. Essentially, what I recommend you doing is going through each of these categories and just creating MIDI or audio tracks for all the kinds of sounds you normally have. So my main vocals is essentially like my acapellas and that kind of thing. Next, we have the kick drum. And for a long time, I had this inside the drums group, but I find for like mixing purposes, it's actually easier to separate it outside, because the drums, you normally take away a lot of the lows, and you can even group the kick and bass together, which is quite common. So having the kick outside the drum group is quite good for flexibility. So inside that group, I simply have a kick pattern, which is a drum rack, but this could quite easily be a simpler. And the reason I have this kind of drum rack is because I like to go in and load the pattern and then basically flick between the different samples. I like having the option of like quickly being able to find the best sound for each type of best sample for each type of sound, essentially. I do this for all the drums. I'll reveal that secret right now. Essentially what you want to do, and what I strongly advise you to do, is basically create custom racks for each type of sound. So if we go custom drum rack, you'll see here I've got, for pretty much every drum hit, I've got like my favorites that I've just found over the years, that I've just collected into one category. If you're not so sure on your favorites, you can just do this at random. And I basically have up to 127 different slots for kicks. And if I was really getting bored of them, I could just create another variation of a drum rack with different kicks. So the possibilities are endless, but you can see if you put that work in up front, how much easier it makes your life. The second one, which I could technically have in its own channel, but I don't bother with. I prefer just to have it in there. Like I could have it up here, is the ghost kick. So essentially the sidechain that everything basically goes to. You do have the option, if you really want, of setting up more like sidechain channels. Like I'll occasionally create a sidechain hat on the offbeat. So you can play around with that, but this is kind of like the main one, the source that I'll sidechain everything to. And it's basically playing the same kick pattern as you'll see here, but it's not playing any sound because it's set to sends only. So you don't hear it, it's only there to basically create a signal for. And then, as you'll see, if I just go down the usual route, compressor and sidechain, I can then select that on every channel, and you'll see it does the same job, the sidechain job. And the reason I have this channel included as well as the kick is because there'll be times in the mix where the kick isn't playing. So if that kick's not playing, then the signal that you've sidechained it to won't duck, which might be intentional, but if you want that kind of sidechain to be constant, then having some kind of ghost sidechain could be really helpful with that. For the drums, I just have different groups for all the different sounds. So we have clap and snares. Let's just... So that's kind of the same kind of Principle is the kicks, basically just a bunch of kicks, claps. So just sounds over the years that I've kind of grown used to, and I think a lot of these I basically just put the whole pack in and then give myself the option, as opposed to wasting time finding these sounds that are like the best. But it's quite hard to hear what's the best when you're searching in isolation. So if you know your samples, great. If you don't, throw them in a drum rack at random, save those drum racks as presets, and then they'll load within the template. So we've got the claps, we've got these snares, we've got the hats, and these are all MIDI, or most of them. Yeah, I think these are all MIDI, and you'll see just here how many samples there is to choose from. So open hat, closed, shaker, for that kind of like 16th groove, the 8th note pattern groove. All the kind of classic drum patterns. Got an extra hat, and then crash. So pretty standard stuff. Basically with the drum, it's all just finding sounds you want to work with and putting in that work up front. For the perks, I change it up a bit. I use like the standard drum rack method. So I've got like standard perk hits. For this one, I'd probably have a lot more to choose from. I'd probably create a lot more variations just because there's more perk sounds. And I've got this modular rack for that iconic kind of minimal glitchy perk stuff. And then I've got a bit different, but something you could technically do within like different groups, is add an audio channel for different loops. So I know I like to chop up perk loops quite a lot and utilize them. So I have this audio channel in there. Sometimes I like to use like hat loops for their specific groove if I'm not able to emulate it in MIDI. So I'll often have an audio channel for that. Same goes with clap and snare. So all mostly MIDI based, but there is potential for audio there. Loops, this is where the majority of the audio comes, because by the time I've built out my basic beat, I like to just grab loops to just fill it out. And even if I haven't like built my basic beat, sometimes I'll start with a loop. So I've got like different types of loops, no kick, pop. I think there is a difference between those two. If not, I've just got two of the same, but that doesn't matter. And like a breakbeat. So 3 different loop kinds that I might utilize. And that's basically the drums. For the bass, I've basically just got 2 empty MIDI channels. I've left it blank because I don't want to kind of limit myself. Like when I open a project, I don't want one of my favorite bass plugins like Trillion automatically on there. I know some projects, I think it was like Luke Van Dyke, when I watched his the chapter on templates by him, I think he had like 2 to 3 MIDI channels with different plugins set up, and I know a lot of people sometimes take that approach, but I normally just keep my options open. I don't like to limit myself. Normally have like 2 to 3 channels for that. 1 for bass, 1 for maybe lower, and then I've started using like acid and textures and stuff recently as well, so just different types of bass you might use. The synths follows a similar approach where I've basically just got 3 channels. Normally the way the synths end up going in my sessions is 1 becomes a lead, 1 becomes a chord, and 1 becomes a pad, and then I group them within. kind of how I've done the drums. So I'll have like a group for leads, a group for chords, and a group for pads, all with like different colors to help me differentiate them. So the synths and the bass mostly follow a MIDI only approach. Effects, I think these are just audio, but they can be MIDI as well. I don't tend to overthink effects. I generally just deal with them as they come. And then finally, I've just got like a channel to place any samples I come across when I'm searching my library and stuff. I also tag these in collections as well, but if there's any samples I want to use within that specific session, I'll just drop them here. So the next part is essentially sends and returns. So sends and returns are nice because they offer the advantage of helping with like CPU. They also allow you to send different sounds, like basically route the different sounds to the same effects and kind of gel them a bit nicer. This is kind of like how I set it up. There's kind of no right or wrong. You can get as creative as you want when it comes to these. My normal template tends to have 3 reverbs, 3 different delays, and a parallel compressor. Basically, the reason I have 3 reverbs is because I like to have 3 different sizes of reverb and basically 3 different rim types. So I've got a short plate, I've got a medium rim, and I've got a large hole, which all give different characteristics. And basically what I've done to kind of find those presets is I've basically just gone into the reverb, and if you're in Ableton 11 you can use hybrid as well. And as you always see here, you've got hole, so that would work on number 3. So I basically just found presets which fit those characteristics and those specific names exactly, pretty much. Medium rim I've used on the second one, and I've probably used one of those presets. And then I think I use hybrid, and you'll see like the amount of, you've got like loads of potential for different sizes of space, different types of space. So you can get very creative with these, and that's just how I've kind of done it. Moving on, I tend to have 3 delays, but for more of a random reason, just because I want 3 delays. There's nothing else to it. I've got the default delay. I've got a ping pong using echo, but you can also do that by doing this on the delay. And then I've got just, I think it's an 1/8 note delay. Dotted. It's a dotted delay. You're probably noticing a theme here. Basically, I'm getting creative and I've found different variations of effects I know I want. And then the final one's just parallel compression. So you can basically set the ratio as infinite, duck it, like duck the threshold by whatever you want really. And when you send the sound to that, it'll make it a lot louder in the mix. So those are essentially the sends and returns. So the final thing I want to talk about when it comes to like a default project are essentially faders and your master channel. So when it comes to faders, essentially you'll notice that the faders have all been brought down -10, and there's no specific reason for the number, but the reason it's turned down as opposed to being on 0 is because as you're adding loads of elements, you'll probably see the mix peak quite quickly when all the faders are at 0, and in the majority of cases you'll be focused on trying to turn everything down in the mix. I prefer to have it set relatively low, because ideally you want, before mastering, you probably want it sitting around like -6. So I like to have it lower down so that I can easily like blend things in, because there's like a common mixing technique that's recommended when you're actually in your mix down stage of moving all the faders down and dragging them up to hear the point where you can start to hear the sound. It's like a pretty recommended technique in the industry. So kind of going off that notion, I like setting my faders low and then having that option and having the flexibility of moving them up or down as opposed to being on 0, where in the majority of the cases you're probably focused on turning down the sound. The final part is the master channel, and this is essentially my rough master chain. So what I've got are 2 effects that I basically use as like reference tools. So I've got this EQ and I've key mapped it to key F. So as a reminder, you can go to key map, we can hit on and off, and we can just choose a key. And it basically allows me to hear the mix without any bass, so I can kind of simulate different arrangements, like without the drop. Next, you've got the mono. So to hear how your full track's going to sound on like a standard club system, and that's also mapped. And then I've got this kind of basic master chain that I got inspired from by producer Mancini. It's basically the equivalent of doing a rough DJ master. So EQ, boosting slightly, a little bit of compression, and then that limiter again. So yeah, that's pretty much could be it for this one. I hope it gave you a better idea of how to go about setting up your Ableton template. As a reminder, I'll leave this template without all the samples because you're going to need to do the hard work there. But if you kind of like the look of this template and think it could work for your specific workflow, then I'll leave that down below. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.